Greetings, family. Welcome back to the Conspiracy to Erase a Nation lecture series. I'm your host, Tony Cherie. If you have not been watching this series, strongly encourage you all to go back and watch previous videos, because this is all around a book that I wrote, Conspiracy to Erase a Nation. The central claim of the book, and I would say blatant proof that I've presented to you all, is that the country that we know as Israel, the kingdom of Israel of the Bible, did not exist inside of Palestine, but existed inside of East Africa. And so we're going to continue on with this series. I think we're reaching a very critical juncture, though, because to me, this juncture is probably the most important thing for the times that we're living in. And that is the purpose of waking up the children of Yasharel, the dispersed children of the tribes of Yasharel, the tribes of Israel, many of whom are not aware of who they are. Many of whom have been suffering under the yoke of oppression, a yoke of being cursed because of the sins of our ancestors, many of whom have been downtrodden, many of whom have been rejected, many of whom have been subjected to horrific levels of discrimination inside of different systems that we live under. Because of that, many of us are at a loss of words as to how to correctly attribute the cause of our troubles. And if we understand that this is something that goes down to our bloodline, particularly what happened before us whenever our ancestors sinned against Yah and did not upkeep the covenant they made with him, if we understand that this is the critical foul error that occurred inside of our bloodline that has to be fixed, then many of us will come to a new level of enlightenment, understanding who we are and what our purpose is inside of this world. So I say all that to say, we're going to talk about a particular group. This group is a tribe that's inside of Ethiopia and also Kenya, an East African tribe, one that is not associated with being Hebrew, because the Hebrew identity has been robbed and has been placed amongst those that we know of being Arabian, and particularly the Northern Arabian. So obviously Palestine, for example, is of the Arabian Peninsula, but it is in the Levant particularly. Because that label of Hebrew is associated with people who are from that particular region, whenever you tell people, well, no, something happened, the switch happened, a conspiracy happened to completely mix us up, completely mix the children of Yasharel up, to where they don't even know what they're doing inside of this world. They feel completely misplaced inside of this world system. They're completely being manipulated, completely being oppressed to the utmost degree. Whenever you want to tell people this, they can't necessarily shake it, because they've been so convinced that these people inside of the Arabian world are those people who come from the bloodline of Yasharel. So we have to understand that this is a mandate on us to go out and tell those people who do not know who they are, who are not aware of the significance of history to our present reality, that Yah does have a plan for them, that there is redemption for them, should they decide to return to the Most High and particularly receive the gift of salvation from Yahusha, his son. But with no further ado, let's get into this subject. As I said, it's about Conspiracy to Erase a Nation, a book that I wrote. If you want a short version of that book, you can go to my Telegram channel. The link to that is in the description. Inside of a pinned comment, I have posted a short version of this book, and we actually deal with this issue inside of the short version of this book. So I encourage you, if you want to have one to give out to people, or if you just want to see what the book is about, it's a good way to get a synopsis. Some people, not all people, but some people gave me pushback in my last video when I said Beta Israel is not the true children of Yasharel, that Beta Israel were actually descended from Edom. And I think one of the pushbacks of that is because we've known them for so long as being the Ethiopian Jews, the Jews of the region. For many of us, they have been a singular group that has proven that Jews or Yahudim could be of African descent. So because we're so married to that concept, we can't necessarily look outside of that concept. But there's a lot of proof that they're not who they say they are as far as being the Hebrews. First, we'll start with the common sense proof. That is the fact that we spoke about at length. I have presented to you the information. Other channels such as Teo Ministries has presented this information, revisionist history. So many people, not just on YouTube, so many of you have actually emailed me and said, oh yes, the stuff that you're studying about Yasharel being in East Africa, that is something that I already know, I've already studied. Here's some more sources. So this is something that many people have delved into, but is of course hidden inside of this current world system, because we know that things are not going to be out in the open when we know who's in control of the world that we're in today. So that being said, a lot of people are giving pushback, I think, because we've been married to the concept that Beta Israel are the Ethiopian Jews. But just to give you some more proof, number one, Beta Israel is a fact. They are not descended from the original inhabitants of the Ethiopia and Eritrea area. So you have to look through the history. You have to dig through the history and get through the propaganda. If you understand that the propaganda has been heavily doctored to give this impression that the group known as Habasha or the Abyssinians were the original inhabitants of the Horn of Africa, then you understand that a lot of propaganda has gone around for so many people, for example, have bought into the propaganda that King Solomon went and had a child with the queen of Sheba, and that this child was of the Menelik dynasty. And some of you probably won't like the fact that I'm telling you that is actually a myth. If anything, that whole story was to hide the fact that King Solomon was from Ethiopia. King Solomon was literally of that region. So the whole idea that Menelik had to escape to Ethiopia to start that dynasty, again, this is a forgery. It's completely wrong. And if you're not able to see that, then again, go back to my first video inside of this series where I proved that the real Yasharel was in East Africa, because if Yasharel was in East Africa and Solomon was in East Africa, then clearly the Queen of Sheba was not in East Africa. So if the biblical record that I established and showed you and many others have showed you is true, that Yasharel was actually in East Africa, then what that means is that the people who inhabited that area at the time that Yasharel would have existed would have been the Hebrews. And we know for a fact it was not the Abyssinians. And many of you who give pushback to that, it's not hard to see, even in a modern context. Again, to all my Ethiopian brothers and sisters, Eritrean brothers and sisters, all of us, if you are in Yahushua HaMashiach, all of you are a part of Yasharel. All of you are either the natural branches or you have been grafted in if you are of Yahushua, if you are born again. So do not take offense at this. But the fact is that it's clearly evident that the Ethiopian mixtures of tribes, many of them are just not indigenous to the region. Even if you look at the look of certain tribes you can see are clearly of an African descent, of original African descent, and certain other ones have been mixed up with the Arabian people who invaded East Africa. So this is not difficult to see, and this is just common sense. Another conflict that exists with the idea that Beta Israel are the real Israelites or the original inhabitants of this region is the fact that Beta Israel are not even the only Ethiopian Jews or the only Ethiopian Yahudim. In fact, if you study the fact that there are other groups that are clearly Hebrew, and I'll name two of them, the Agau and also the Kamant. These are two groups of Ethiopians that are closely associated with Beta Israel. However, the issue with that is that they actually genetically could not be the same group of Beta Israel. So I'm reading from my book, Conspiracy to Erase a Nation. Agal, the actual word for Ehud, means Judean, which resembles the Hebrew word Yahuda or Yahudi. Agals are known to practice a Hebraic form of paganism. Another group with a close relationship to the Agals and Beta Israel was the Kimant, also identified as a Hebraic group. However, their ethnicities differentiate, as Beta Israel does not share a semblance of features with the two despite a close historical relationship. Beta Israel is Habasha or Ethiopian Semitic. So how does this happen? Think about it. How does it happen that there are multiple groups that people all agree these groups were practicing some form of Torah, and yet the Ethiopian Jews known as Beta Israel, they have no genetic semblance to the Agau or the Kamant. These people are considered Cushitic. Clearly, there's a dividing line, and one of these groups cannot actually be Hebrew, because if one is from the Arabian Peninsula and the other one is Cushitic, which again, I spoke about this in a previous video. Cushitic, we're using that term to talk about people of African ancestry. Does not mean that they are not a descendant of Shem. As I showed in a previous video, being a descendant of Shem means that you're of the Shemitic bloodline. But if you're Semitic, as people commonly know the term, that simply means that you use a Semitic language. So despite the fact that the Agao and the Kamant are considered Cushitic, the fact is that they are the original inhabitants of this region. Their bloodline is of the original inhabitants of this region. The Abyssinians, again, would have come from Arabia, which obviously is a different bloodline. So the group that we're talking about again today is the Oromo. So, and again, in addition to the Agao, in addition to the Kamant, the Oromo also are original descendants of this particular region, descendants of Yasharel. So just going to encyclopedia.com, the Kingdom of Damant was a powerful and prosperous African kingdom that ruled for over 200 years. Located in what is today Ethiopia, the Kingdom of Damant was one of the most influential political entities that emerged during Africa's era of kingdoms from the 14th to the 19th centuries. The ruling dynasty was believed to have been founded by two brothers and traced its lineage through 10 ruling families. The people who resided within the boundaries of this great realm were known as Oromo or Wolomo, as they referred to themselves, and their language was called Afan Oromo. So two things from what I read should be instantly seen as completely relevant to this history. Number one, the fact that the original inhabitants of the Damant Kingdom would have come from 10 families. Who do we know comes from a family close to 10? Well, obviously the tribe of Yasharel came from 12 tribes. So it is historically accounted for that 10 families controlled this kingdom. And we know from the biblical record, it was not 10, it was actually 12. The other thing, though, that is of significance, the Oromo were the original inhabitants of the Damant Kingdom. So the Oromo would have been the actual Hebrews. Now, some people are going to push back on this. Well, I'm very sure many people are going to push back on this because what I've learned from studying this and continuing my studies of this is that the Oromos are probably the most discriminated group inside of Ethiopia. They're probably the most abhorred group inside of Ethiopia, disliked group. And I understand there's tribal conflict both ways. So it's not like the Oromo, I'm not saying that they haven't done anything inside of these tribal wars. I mean, all times we're being instigated to not just be victims, but also be perpetrators inside of this system of control. So, but I've learned that the Oromo definitely are very much discriminated against inside of this country, and I would say in certain circles even hated. So I'm not surprised about the pushback. I'm sure I'll get pushback in the comments because this group is so abhorred. But the important thing that we have to stay focused on is what the biblical record says, what the biblical record predicts about the children of Yasharel, the Hebrews, what happened, what would happen to them, how would they be treated inside of the world. Anytime you see a people who are elevated inside of the world as a group, there should be a bell alarm going off saying that you cannot be the Hebrews because the curses that are inside of Deuteronomy 28 would not have been fulfilled if that were the case. Another thing I'm currently studying is the fact that the Oromo people, their language isn't Hebrew from what I've read. So I've offered the possibility on this channel, the possibility being that, hey, they could have originally spoke Hebrew and the language had been wiped out. But one thing I will note is that the Abyssinians throughout history have purposely tried to quash the Oromo language. And there's possibilities as far as why that is the case. Is Oromo the original language of the Kingdom of Yasharel? That's something that, again, I'm currently studying. If anyone has information on that, let's continue this study. However, let's be real. Only thing that we know as being Hebrew is what we have been given inside of translated documents that we already know are translated. So I'm not so beholden to the idea that what we believe is Hebrew has to be actual Hebrew. Some of you might not like that. I understand, but I'm just giving you my thought process and where I'm studying right now as far as how the Oromo people could possibly be the missing link as far as completely understanding what happened to Yasharel and the culture of Yasharel, how it was wiped out, and how it is the case that something so major as far as a people being switched, a people identity being completely changed, how that could have escaped the world as far as notice. So again, as I spoke about last week, there has been an intentional effort to wipe out the Oromo culture from this region. And this has led to the wipeout of the Oromo from the region that we know of Yasharel. So the region would have been Eritrea, particularly the middle to lower part of Eritrea, and also Ethiopia, the northern part of Ethiopia. Yet most Oromos are not even present inside of this region. They've been pushed out to a region known as Oromia, which is significant because scripture tells us that the Yahudim would not be inside of the Holy Land until the time of the Gentiles is fulfilled. To this day, multiple myths are floated around about the origins of the Oromo. For example, some people say they came from the sea. Some people say they came from Madagascar. People have come up with different theories to try to explain this away. But anyone who has seriously studied this in a scholarly fashion has come to the conclusion, no, the Oromo did not come from another country. They did not move into the area. These were the original occupants of Axum. They were the original occupants of Damont. It's not only scholars who have put this forth as saying, no, they're the original occupants of Damont, but the Oromo themselves have a very consistent oral history that says that no, they were not new to the area, that they actually ruled Axum, they actually ruled Damont. So I want to read from some sources to give the oral history as attested to by the Oromo people. So this is from Professor Asafa Jalanta. He says, Ethiopia is the name that was eventually given to the geographic unit created when Abyssinia, a cluster of small kingdoms in Northeast Africa, expanded in the mid-1800s by conquering independent nations in the region using firearms provided by European power. To obtain slaves and economic resources, the emerging Ethiopian state committed genocide on peoples like the Oromos. The Oromo population was reduced from 10 million to 5 million through war, slavery, massive killings, disease, and war-induced famine during the second half of the 19th century. According to Alexander Belatovich, the dreadful annihilation of more than half of the population during the conquest took away from the Galas or Oromo all possibilities of thinking about any sort of uprising. Without a doubt, the Gala, with their at least 5 million population occupying the best land, all speaking one language, could represent a tremendous force if united. The Ethiopian colonizers started to dehumanize Oromos by changing their name into Gala. These names were invented in the process of removing these people from their respective cultural historical roots and making them the target of destruction, enslavement, colonialism, and continued subjugation. The appellation Gala was given to Oromos as a name of contempt and derogation. It has characterized them as slaves, pagan, uncivilized, barbaric, inferior, and ignorant. This name was invented to destroy their Oromo-ness and to devalue Oromo culture, history, and tradition. In Abyssinia proper, Gala and Barya have been used interchangeably. Gala is the name of racist ridicule in academia and popular discourse. Habashas have effectively used the discourse of cultural racism in destroying and suppressing other peoples. Cultural racism can be defined as the conscious and subconscious conviction of politically dominant population group that imposes its cultural patterns and practices through its social institutions in an attempt to destroy or suppress the cultural patterns and practices of the colonized and dominated population. I'm now going to read from an article from a website called Oromo Blog. And while I'm reading this, think about the things that have been prophesied from scripture as far as Yasharel, as far as the things they would suffer because of the rebellion against Yah, as far as the ancestors who we come from. So I'm reading from this blog. It says, the Habasha elites tell us that Ethiopian is the only country in Africa that was not colonized by European superpowers. I myself have heard that and proudly waved the flag, Ethiopia, good job, you weren't colonized, but that's only part of the story. They weren't colonized by Europeans, but they were colonized. It says, what the Habasha elites were unable to understand was the fact that there was no country called Ethiopia when the Europeans came to Africa in the mid-19th century. The present Ethiopian got its present map in 1900 after the Habasha king, Menelik II, completed his expansion towards the south. Menelik is the same Menelik that many of us have been taught was a descendant of Solomon. Are we to think it is a coincidence that someone who comes from Arabia, who's trying to establish his presence and his dominance in a region that was biblical Yasharel, that this same person would create a myth around themselves that would say that they were a descendant of Solomon. There are ample evidences that the Habasha had Semitic origins drawn from the Middle East. Again, Semitic meaning Arabian. Remember that. They are close kin to Arabs and the Jews meaning the Jews who come from Palestine. However, they claim that they are indigenous people of Africa, whereas according to them, other nations inhabiting in the Horn of Africa, such as the Oromo, came into Africa from Madagascar, crossing the Indian Ocean. The Habasha elites and priests wrote distorted history about the Oromo who are indigenous to Africa. The Oromos belong to the Cushitic origin. The Cushitic people lived in the Horn of Africa as far as the present-day Egypt. The Cushitic people are Black people, and they had their own civilization. The Cushite moved southwards. Among them were the Oromos and the Agaus. Remember, the Agaus are the other group that we spoke about who were Hebrew. Moreover, the Semitic people, such as the Amhara and the Tigris, crossed the Red Sea and invaded the land that originally belonged to the Cushitic people. Naturally, the Semitic people like invading other lands and establishing themselves. What the Habashas did to the Oromos and what the Arabs did to the indigenous Africans proves this fact. In the places they settled, they tried to destroy the native settlers and impose their culture and values on them. The invaders from the Arab land built their own empire along the Red Sea coast that later became the Aksumite Empire. The Aksumite Empire was started by Cushitic people, such as the Oromo and the Agawa. The Tigrians claim that they were the ones who founded the empire. There are some historical facts that prove that the obelisk in Aksum were built by the Oromos and other Kushite people. In the 400 AD, the king of Aksum, Ezana, accepted Christianity and made it a state religion. Since then, the Habasha king used Christianity as an instrument for consolidating their power. The Aksumite Empire weakened in the 12th century because it lost the trade route it had been using for years to the Arabs. The external forces such as Arabs developed interest in the Red Sea and threatened the Aksum Empire. Eventually, the empire declined, failing to defend itself against the external forces. So to me, this was a very compelling narrative, a very compelling history. And the other accounts that I was able to uncover were very compelling evidences that, yes, the Oromo were the original inhabitants of the region, and that would essentially mean that they were Yasharel. But is that the only evidence? Is that the only strong evidence? Actually, I think the most convincing evidence to me, because this is, again, something that I don't even think the Oromos, for the most part, claim to have Hebraic roots. The most convincing evidence, though, is their religion. So, as I read earlier, the other group that would have been Hebrew, Yahudim, would have been the Agaus and the Kamat. What do you remember that I read about those two groups? They practiced a Hebraic form of paganism, meaning while Beta Israel, who, as I stated, they come from Palestine. They bring their new form of religion called Judaism. And this form of religion, it's organized, right? They come back to bring this to the Holy Land. But the Agaus and the Kamat, while they practice a Hebraic form of religion, they actually have a lot of paganism mixed in their religion. And we know why, because Yasharel rebelled against Yahuwah, mixing with different religions, worshiping Bel, worshiping Molech. We've been told all of this from scripture. The same exact thing is the case for the Oromo. Their religion is not very different, except for it is a paganized form of the Hebrew religion. I'm going to read to you some things about it. So I want you to listen to the description of the Oromo religion. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing this right. I believe it's Wakafana. So Wakafana, and this is again from my book, Conspiracy to Erase a Nation, which, much like the Agau and Kamat religious practices, resemble a paganized Hebraic religion. Oromo traditionalists are monotheistic. I want to emphasize that because this is something that's very unique in this region. They're monotheistic, and they come out of a region that is the opposite of monotheistic. So the Oromo traditionalists are monotheistic. They believe there is one God named Waka. Waka existed before all things, was the world's creator, is all-powerful, omniscient, omnipotent, benevolent, pure, good, and the source of love and truth. In addition, Waka is intolerant of sin, injustice, crime, and all falsehood. In worshiping Waka, Oromo never worshipped carved statues, trees, rivers, mountains, or animals as substitutes. According to the Oromo, Waka created the first humans from the soil by breathing into it. Waka used to be present on Earth with humans, but when humans sinned, he left Earth to go to the sky and became invisible. Sin and human error are why Waka followed evil things to exist in the world, and illness and misfortune are considered a punishment from Waka for the sins a person has committed. However, people living according to Waka's order will be happy and respected community members. There are also divinities created by Waka called Ayana, each seen as a manifestation of the one Waka, who acts as an intermediary between human beings and Waka. Thus, the commonalities between Waka and Yahuwah, the Elohim of the Bible, are astounding. So again, this was very significant to me because this is pretty much unheard of. The fact that there's a monotheistic religion amongst pagan religions, a monotheistic religion where there's only one God. He is in heaven. He's the sky God. We know that Yahuwah is in heaven, right? And this singular deity says that the tradition says that he breathes into soil and created humankind. He abhors sin. He punishes people who do sin. All of these obviously have great semblance to what we know of Yahuwah. So this in itself, I think, is strong proof. In fact, we have less of a record for other groups that we agree are Hebrew. For example, the Limba. This in itself is strong proof that these people are actually of Hebrew origin. But besides this, probably the other proof that we will get into next week is the fact that the Oromo literally get dragged all over Ethiopia. They get pushed out of the north, and from there we're going to see an entire slave trade. An entire slave trade specifically is going to target the Oromo. And what are we told in scripture? That the children of Yahshua will be scattered to the four corners of the earth. So that's where we're going to leave it off for now. I think next week we're probably going to get into the dispersion of the Oromo, starting from the dispersion from Axum and also the dispersion throughout the eastern part of the world and then later the western part of the world. So that's it for this video. I thank you all for watching, and Yah willing, I'll see you in the next one.